Our section is focused on reducing distance between United States law schools and the world through welcoming international students to our Master of Laws and other law degree programs, creating opportunities for JD students to study abroad during law school, and implementing programming and technology to increase the interaction between US law school students and their peers abroad. So along these lines, we have prepared today's webinar on finding legal jobs around the world, how LLM and JD study abroad programs help. So many law students view international legal education through the lens of finding employment, that we prepared today's program to explore this exact question. The large number of registrants we have for today's webinar speaks to its importance. We're also planning an exciting program for the AALS annual meeting in January, details of which should be coming out over the next few months. Before we begin, I want to thank the leadership of our section for all the suggestions and guidance on this program. I want to acknowledge Sharnaz Joshi at George Washington, Diane Edelman at Villanova, and thanks Diane for your comment in the chat, John Thornton at Northwestern, and Karen Jones at Houston. I also would like to thank our executive committee who have been really supportive, and I've placed their names in the chat. I also want to give a special thank you to Clarissa Ortiz at AALS for all the help in preparing for the webinar. So thank you, Clarissa, for all the encouragement and support as we prepared for today. When our section leadership discussed this webinar earlier this year, we immediately thought of today's speakers as perfect to address the topic, and I was delighted that they accepted our invitation to speak. Professor Carol Silver is at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and Malcolm McNeil is partner and international practice co-leader of Arendt Fox. Carol is very well recognized for her work in international legal education and global practice. And Malcolm has rich experience as an international practitioner who has counseled and hired JD and LLM students. I've placed their full biographies in the chat where you will see their very distinguished backgrounds. For today's conversation, Carol will have the first 15 minutes, Malcolm the second, and then we will open up the remainder of the session to questions and answers. We intentionally only invited 2 guests for this webinar to enable lots of time for questions, which I will moderate. So please send your questions for Carol and Malcolm to me through the Q&A tab below, so I will have them. And also please feel free to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat as well. After the webinar, we will convert the format of this event so we can proceed with our section social to get to know each other, welcome our new members, and continue the conversation. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Carol. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. I'm really delighted to be able to participate today. So students coming into the US to study certainly have jobs and careers on their minds. And the question posed for us is how to help them capitalize on their decision to study overseas to get good and perhaps better jobs than what they'd have had if they'd stayed home for their legal education. And the opposite, same for students who come from the United States and study overseas. So to set the stage, I thought it would be useful to clarify who is studying abroad in the field of law. According to the Institute for International Education, which gathers information about international higher education generally, there are over 1 million international students in the US, or there were over 1 million during the 2019-2020 academic year. Of those, just over 14,000 students were enrolled in programs in the field of law. So looking at other sources of information, I'm just going to share my screen. We can figure out of those 14,000 how many are studying at a law school, or at least try and make a good estimated guess. Back in 2016, when the ABA was sharing information about the size of post-JD programs, which includes LLMs and SJDs, there were nearly 14,000 students in those programs. Not all of those are international, but a large proportion are. And the number of international students studying in JD degree programs also has risen over the years. In the current school year, nearly 3,500 international students who require a visa to study in the US were enrolled in US law school JD programs. And this is a year when the last administration's immigration and visa policies were in effect and the COVID-19 pandemic made travel nearly impossible. So IIE's 14,000 figure for international students in the field of law seems well within the realm of possibility and perhaps even conservative. In talking with international LLM and JD graduates and students about their US legal education experiences for my research, jobs are on their mind as a motivating factor for choosing the US as their place of study. Based on research done in the mid-2000s, LLM graduates described advancing career opportunities, strengthening English language skills, and gaining cultural exposure that comes from living outside of their home countries as their motivations. And more recent research shows that while these factors remain relevant, today's students increasingly describe the LLM as a means to another end, whether it's the bar, a US-based practice experience, or both, and that other end itself is necessary in order for the LLM credential to serve as a mark of distinction in the student's home country. As a Chinese LLM student explained in talking about an unpaid summer internship, she said she didn't care about being paid. She said, it's not a big problem. It's part-time. For LLMs, the most important thing, she said, is to get US experience to help us get a permanent job later and passing the bar. But the very popularity of the LLM has diluted its strength as a signal of distinction and quality in many contexts. This is more relevant in particular countries than others, but the combination of this dilution effect and shifts in demographics of sending countries from Europe to Asia over the last 10 years or so has fueled the enrollment trend of international students into JD programs instead of LLM programs, or sometimes both. So sometimes they choose LLM programs as sort of a test to see can they do the JD. For many of these students, a home country sensitivity to academic rankings also means they're aiming for the most highly ranked, most selective law schools. And this is evident in enrollment differences for international students between schools in the top 20 or so US News rank categories to those outside of that category. In fact, over the first 3 quarters of the decade of 2010, the greatest proportionate increase in any segment of the law student population was in the international student population. The proportional representation of non-resident aliens during that period increased more than did the proportional representation of other minority groups, including Black students, Latino students, and Asian students. This was more significant in more elite law schools, and that's illustrated by the pie chart in this slide, which shows enrollment for 2020 for a group of schools generally in the top 20 of US News. Last, just to offer some insight into the home countries of international JD and LLM students, according to a combination of sources, the most significant sending countries for LLMs have been China, South Korea, and Japan, while for JDs, they're Canada, China, and South Korea. So the takeaway is that Asia Pacific is a very important sending region for international law students coming to the US. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future looks like with regard to their enrollment. There isn't much information about who studies overseas coming from US JD programs. There's a 2010 study that Adelaide Ferguson did for NAFSA, and she estimated that as many as 10% of 1Ls might study overseas during law school. So based on today's numbers, that's about 4,000 students a year. I'm not aware of any study of JDs who study overseas. I wasn't able to find it. So if anyone knows of this, I'd be grateful for a reference. And I'm not sure it's possible to infer why students study overseas in the outbound context. It may be related to the same sorts of efforts to distinguish themselves from their classmates that's part of the inbound story, might be to perfect or deepen language fluency, perhaps Also, it's similar to an interest of inbound students in pursuing a particular area of law that's distinctly related to the location, like studying EU privacy law in an EU country, for example. So based on this sense of who the international students are, let's consider how an overseas study experience might factor into job opportunities and careers generally. And I want to talk about 3 issues: law school experiences, where the jobs are, and the bar exam. So first, to go back to the reasons that students talk about their motivation for studying overseas, they think it might improve their skills, whether it's language or something else. It might show they can live independently and escape the parochialism of their home country environment. They might gain substantive expertise. They might gain a license that gives them status either in the host or home country. And they might meet people and interact with organizations that will help them broaden their social and professional networks, and also might signify a particular prestige or status that will be valuable in their career simply by having been associated with them. So in order to achieve nearly all of these goals, one common thread is the importance of interacting with host country students, professionals, and organizations that students anticipate meeting when they're overseas. And that goes both for outbound US students and inbound international students. This interaction will help them boost their language skills, understand the implications of particular legal issues in society and society generally, feel successful in being on their own overseas, and really begin to understand their host country. But at least for incoming international students, this anticipation often is frustrated by structural and interpersonal divisions that segregate them from US students. To bring this home, let me share a diagram of the interaction among law students in 2 law schools that I've been studying along with a group of law and sociology faculty to learn about their social interactions. This study is underwritten by Access Lex Institute, and this is just a very superficial look. But the study involves surveying first-year JD students and LLM students at several law schools. And in this diagram, what you see is a representation of the social networks of first years and LLMs based on their nominations of friends in law school. And these depict friendship nominations about midway through the first semester. The depiction on the left shows the identity of respondents based on their self-identified race or ethnicity. And on the right, it shows their assigned section or program. Yellow is for LLM, and the other colors represent a JD section. Together, these 2 factors explain most of the network observations. There's some pulling together across programs based on shared racial identity, which is visible particularly in the left-hand image at the lower right-hand side of the largest of the 3 blobs. This is the same for a second law school where the LLM program's population identifies mostly as white or Asian, and the same segregation is visible in both images. Similar segregation effects have been documented in my earlier research where I surveyed JD students in all years of law school. And it also was present in a recent study of international JD students that I did with Sweta Balakrishnan. We found that many international JDs experience law school in the US feeling marginalized and isolated, and generally their friendship circles are with other international students who are mostly from their home country or region. Certain schools, in fact, also have policies that solidify the separation of LLMs and JDs, such as not allowing LLMs to participate in law firm and other employer networking events, or forbidding them from participating in clinics where students often have a chance to really get to know each other through small working groups. And removing these sorts of barriers is a first step for law schools. And of course, I recognize that there are lots of balancing considerations that law schools have to address, including the ABA mandate that they're supposed to be focusing on JD programs. But even removing structural factors likely isn't enough, because it isn't enough to bring international students into the school. The administration also needs to help create avenues for interaction and developing relationships. For international students interested in working in the US, meeting employers is a challenge, and it's important. The variety of potential employers for international students isn't as broad as for Americans because so many government positions aren't open to them. So law firms assume an outsized importance, and many firms express indifference at best towards hiring international students. But this indifference makes it even more important for the students to have a chance to meet them. Law schools can facilitate this by adopting policies including all students in events where any student meets and networks with lawyers and law firms. Beyond providing opportunities, more may be needed because international students can be unfamiliar with the ways of interacting that are customary in the host country. And again, this goes for both outbound and inbound students. One research interview I conducted with an LLM student from China was instructive. She said she was determined to try and find a job in the United States. And so she went to a lot of receptions, especially law firm receptions, even though she said they weren't for LLMs. But I really wanted to stay, so I'll try anything, she said. I want to learn how to communicate with others in a short time. This is not a common skill in China, which was her home country. We don't have short time talking. What she was referring to was small talk or small chat, small talk. And so she said she started experimenting with how to do this. She would go into an Uber and talk to the Uber driver. And she quickly learned how to start talking to people, even if they didn't invite her to have a conversation. And her takeaway was she didn't need to wait for a law firm partner to talk to her. She could start the conversation herself. And that was revealing to her, extremely important. Whether it's learning to engage in small talk or knowing what to talk about, international students need support in navigating their host country's legal and professional environment. In research interviews, international JDs talked about learning about a particularly American topic in order to have something to talk about during interviews with law firm lawyers and partners. And they especially talked about sports, professional baseball and college football. They said they had no interest in sports, but they knew that it would give them something to talk about. And of course, those are the kinds of lessons that law schools can teach international students if they're intent on helping them transform their overseas study into career opportunities. International students often describe focusing on particular US markets for their job search and often focus on New York. And it turns out that students are not surprisingly right about this. So this slide shows information about a pre-green card paperwork filing done by a group of 7 law firms during the period of 2017 until 2021. And the data is broken out by the office location that the application relates to. And I chose firms based on the West Coast, Midwest, and East Coast to try to get a sense of differences. It's not a representative sample, it's a very small sample, but the results confirmed the students' New York focus because a greater proportion of applications were filed relating to New York than any other location overall, and individually for each firm except for 2 of the West Coast firms. So having this and other kinds of insight into which markets are particularly open to sponsoring international students can better help schools counsel the students about strategies for their careers. Last, the bar. Being able to qualify for a bar exam is an enormous asset for the US generally with regard to attracting international law students. There's a lot of variation among states, but John asked us to consider the relationship or compare California and New York. And so during the last year, New York not only attracted more international graduates to its bar, but also had a substantially higher pass rate than California. DC's pass rate is approaching New York's, and it just changed the rules to permit distance education to qualify for bar eligibility. So that might change the dynamics of choosing a jurisdiction in the future. But the interaction of opportunities, at least as is exemplified by the labor condition applications and the need for bar qualification locally, makes New York an obvious destination. Moreover, international lawyers working outside of the US often equate New York to the US, and that reinforces the importance of that market for international students, particularly because they may relocate outside of the US sometime during their career. So how does overseas study help students with their careers? It signals that students have taken steps to broaden their opportunities, and this alone is important as employers try to assess the entrepreneurialism and initiative of law students. But to actually transform that signal into a practical opportunity, more is needed to help students develop relationships while they're overseas. This might be through preparatory work before the student travels. I know Indiana's Maurer School of Law teaches its outbound students about their host country's legal profession before sending them overseas for the summer. And that's a great model to follow. But doing the same for incoming students also will help them get the most from their time overseas. And law school policy changes can support students in connecting legal studies to the host country legal profession. There may be some need to support career advisors in learning about the home countries of incoming students, or to help them create connections with career advisors or experts in those countries. And law schools would do well to invest in alumni studies to learn about their international students' careers alongside those of their domestic students. It's a big agenda, and I hope it offers some food for thought. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol. And we do have some questions for you in the Q&A, but we'll hold on those until the second part of this discussion, since I'd now like to turn the floor over to Malcolm to share your remarks.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this. I've been very interested in international work since my first year out of law school, because I left a large firm and started my own office and had a small one-man office at LAX. And from there, I joined the Chamber of Commerce, and that was how I blossomed my local international practice. And Carol, by the way, thank you so much. My practice never comes into contact with those statistics. I only have anecdotal feeling from the practice of law. So that was very, very helpful. And thank you for that. As you pointed out at the outset, John, I'm the International Practice Group co-chair at Aaron Fox. And the first thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to comment on your initial comment, which is that, yes, a lot of students just immediately are thinking one word, or maybe it's three words: employment, 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 when they're looking at getting an additional credential, whether it's an inbound student coming to the US to get an LLM, or even if it's an outbound US student looking to go overseas. My anecdotal experience is that the US students going overseas typically do so to get that broad range of experience, and they intend to come home. Again, that's not everybody, but that's many of them. On the other hand, much of my practice has been based in Asia, and my experience is exactly as Carol indicated earlier, and that is the law firms that were growing in China in the 1990s were basically insisting that their partners have English language skills, because they knew that most of the work was going to be outward bound. And along with those English language skills, they wanted the credential of an LLM. So the starting point that I would tell everybody is that international law or international experience is not a packaged item. You need to do your homework and decide what it is that you want to do and why you're applying at a given firm. My firm, for example, does not have overseas offices, but we do a tremendous amount of international work. And we're on both coasts. We're in New York and Los Angeles and Boston and DC and San Francisco. Those are our office hubs. And most of the, or all of those cities actually have a different international focus. And when I've interviewed students and brought them in, or I should say candidates who have gotten an LLM degree somewhere, it's amazing how they focus so carefully on their degree. But when I would ask simple questions such as, what else do you do to demonstrate that you're internationally minded, they would sometimes be stumped by that question. And I would tell them, well, do you read The Economist? What do you do to have an internationally minded, let's say, frame of reference? Because that's important, because none of us can be experts in every country, and I'm not an expert in every country, but I do know that if a client comes to me with a Latin American issue or an African issue or a European issue, I know sort of the steps that I need to take to advise a client effectively on whatever the matter may be. And it's very important that the students do their homework and have more focus on exactly what it is that they want to do, because, as I said, international law is not, it's not a packaged experience. Do you wish to be a litigator? Do you wish to be an arbitrator? Do you wish to be an M&A lawyer, cross-border, or a tax lawyer, or a trade lawyer? And that's important that students give that some thought so they can hold a good conversation with an interviewer if they're looking for a job, because they don't necessarily have to stick with that. They can be flexible. You know, as the old joke went from Groucho Marx. He says, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others, right? Well, you might have other interests too, and that's good to bring to the table when you're in an interview process. But you should have some focus. And further, you should know the firm that you're talking to and know its strengths, and say, yes, I have a particular interest in your firm and your office. Because as we know, Los Angeles and New York are very different markets. They're large metropolitan areas. But are you interested in Wall Street? Are you interested in stocks? Are you interested in entertainment? Are you interested in banking? What sector are you looking at? Because I think experience is showing us that more and more of the practice of law is going to sectors where we're looking at things and we're looking at them and packaging them differently, such as fashion and retail. Or fashion. I'm sorry, I thought we had a glitch in the computer for a second. That it's fashion and retail, or it's pharmaceuticals, or whatever the area may be. But we're sort of segueing away from a specific area of the law to look at a client's needs in a given area. So the one thing that I'm telling students is to be focused, because once they come in, they can look at the area and show why they're capable to do the job that they're doing that they're asking for, and what is their long-term plan. I like international students, and I like talking to them, and I like talking to international partners, because I think that we become less parochial in our views and less myopic, and being very laser focused. And my practice, I can tell you that over 35 years of practice, I probably touched many areas of the law. Obviously, I have my focuses in arbitration and litigation and inbound transactional work, but I've talked to people about patents. I've talked to people about expanding their businesses. I've talked to them about white collar crime. There's been a lot of things that cross our desk necessarily by virtue of the international moniker. But for the students, in the old days, I think that when I say old days, I'm saying 1990s and 2000s. I'm speaking for myself as part of those old days. But I think that the degrees did have, let's say, in and of themselves, they were a credential that stood on its own. But I think in Carol's remarks, she made a remark that, yeah, with the numbers of LLM students being turned out, we need to do something to demonstrate that it's LLM plus, meaning what is it in addition to the degree? The degree is an excellent stepping stone. It's sort of like learning a language. You know, I tell people, they say, well, I must have a language. I must learn French or Russian or Chinese. And I'm like, well, not so fast. I've given speeches in 19 languages, but then I revert to English immediately, meaning I've demonstrated the sensitivity, but the study of the language is not something that I've been able to incorporate with all of the other challenges and time sucks that I have on the practice. So what I've tried to say to people is, no, you can demonstrate cultural sensitivity, cultural attenuity, if you will, through making sure that you're regionally understanding an area, whether it be Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, and you can also you do that through making yourself. I mentioned The Economist earlier. I don't agree with all of their viewpoints in their magazine, but I do like their articles, and I do like it does keep me posted on what's going on everywhere, which you can't get from CNN or Fox or MSNBC or even the Times or whatever our local news outlets are. Because if you do that, you're going to be more flexible because I immerse our students, or I should say our lawyers, I immerse our lawyers into the immediate interaction with clients. So if we're going to meet with clients in the conference room who are Chinese or South Korean or French or North African, I want you to be able to I want to have the confidence that you're going to be flexible enough to be able to use the general international skills that you have and drill down with whomever it is that you're doing business with. So in the international, or I should say in the interview process, what I like to see from a student I keep saying student because we're talking about LLMs, but they're really lawyers, right? But so I use those terms interchangeably for purposes of this. What I want to see them demonstrate to me is that they have the confidence to move forward, not just with the eagerness or anxiousness to get a job, but that they've actually focused on the thing that they want. They tell me that they're interested in international arbitration. I might veer them toward New York, which is a better international hub than, say, California, although we're working hard to create our own arbitration center here because we had certain peculiarities of our bar association that stop students from or lawyers from coming to California and arbitrating on a matter. It was peculiar to California, but that's gone. So, but generally, I would say that probably DC or New York would be better if that's what you're looking for. If you're looking for entertainment, if you're looking for media, I'd say, well, come to California, come to LA. Looking for high tech, looking for startups, so we'll go to Silicon Valley or San Francisco. So, and all of those areas are internationally focused because most of those companies that are in those realms are doing work internationally. They're not just locally based firms. So the real question is, I say, think beyond this interview and think beyond, say, the next year, but think into tell me what your plans are for 5 years into the future. That sounds like one of those trite old interview questions, but it really isn't. It's more relevant today because we know that lawyers move more frequently these days. Lawyers will move from firm to firm or country to country. So the question is, where do you see yourself in the practice of law? Not where do you see yourself necessarily, and we don't need to know all of those details, but we do need to know, what is it that's bringing you here, and what can we count on you for, and what have you studied that brings you to our firm. I've had a lot of experience with German legal interns because Germany's bar has an intern program where they'll send an intern to your firm and they actually pay for that firm to participate in your office. And I've brought them in and I've interviewed. Well, I should say over the last 20 years, I've probably taken in 15 interns. Not this last year, unfortunately, because last year was a different year, as we all know. But what I've always found is that those students, because they are students at that time, because they're waiting to get their ultimate credential. But I asked them, what brings you to the United States? And many of them have the same outward-looking thoughts that Carol mentioned earlier. The outward-looking thoughts of I wanted to polish my English language skills. I wanted to know what it is to be a lawyer. Some of them have a belief that the legal hierarchy, if you will, in Germany is not as flexible as it is in the U.S. But in the U.S., they're exploring whether or not they'd like to be a lawyer in the United States. So I quiz them about those things, and they have a level of curiousness that is very, very interesting. Chinese lawyers, on the other hand, are looking to get the LLM so that it gives them better job opportunities when they go home, because most of the Chinese lawyers that I have talked to get the LLM here and intend to go back because the Chinese legal market is sophisticated now, and they have large, well-known firms that do turn out excellent legal work. Some want to stay here in the U.S., of course, but either way, they're coming to they have a thirst for knowledge, which is sort of partial. It's mixed up with getting a job, but it's also a level of curiousness that I think is effective we like to say as lawyers that we're all curious, right? I mean, that's why we're in this profession, and we like to ask questions, and we get Socratically quizzed ourselves. But the idea is that you want to see that continuing education, not as just a tool to get a job, but I want to see that they're actually using it to expand their intellectual capability and their practical skills at the same time. So that would be. Those would be. I'm not sure. I was looking at time, John. I didn't want to. I could go on and on.
You're spot on. You're spot on. Yeah, and no, thank you for those remarks. I think one of the common points is, rather than being able to provide very specific entrees as to these are the jobs that you should find, what I found common is that regardless of whether we're talking about international students coming to the United States or our JD students going abroad, a key part and skill that's needed to find a job is to increase cultural competence. And study abroad, either way, helps that. And for the international students coming here, Carol, you mentioned a student from China who needed to learn a different kind of networking skill, the soft talk, the sports, and how to build relationships in a different context from how that kind of conversation would be done in China. And then Malcolm, you mentioned, the students who have studied abroad have that or an increased competence. So as they're, doing work or looking for jobs, if they say, yes, if I'm across the table from somebody from South Korea, well, I know something about how there might be a different thought process, and at least be aware to ask those questions in advance. And I think that's a major takeaway that we can benefit from today. Now, I had prepared, as we discussed before, I prepared a bunch of questions for us. Well, there are so many questions in the Q&A right now that we'll do our best to get through them. And if not, we may have to do a part 2. And so the first question goes to Carol, and the second question goes to Malcolm. So Carol, the first question is coming from our friend Teresa Kaiser Jarvis at Michigan. And she's saying she loves your network structure diagram and would love to do it at her law school to see how they're doing. Does it exist in an implementable form anywhere?
I don't know what implementable means. So this is based on a survey of all 1Ls and LLM students that asked them about their backgrounds and their demographic characteristics, and also asked them about their friendship networks and mentors. And it allowed them to nominate. So there was a drop-down box that allowed them to nominate students in their 1L year and in the LLM program by name. And so we had a great response rate, and students cross-nominated one another to create that network effect. And then friends of friends of friends also create a network effect. So this is, the diagram actually was done by Tony Paik at UMass, and who's a sociology professor at UMass. And he is he's part of our project. So the answer is sure, you could do the survey as part of this research study if you're interested, and I'm happy to talk about that. And then Tony can make one of these beautiful models for you. But other than that, I don't know how to do it. And I don't know how to make the model.
Great. Thank you, Carol. And so Malcolm, the next question is coming to you, asking if you have any tips for a US citizen trying to find a job overseas after graduation with a study abroad experience from undergraduate, but not one from law school.
Well, there's a little bit of a sharp left turn in that question. I thought I was ready to answer it. I was going to also, one of the things I wanted to mention is I'm past president of the International Young Lawyers Association, AIJA, the AIJA, Association Internationale des Jeunes Avocats. And I've been a member of that organization since right after I opened my office, and I'm still an honorary president today, and I'm invited back to entertain the crowds from time to time and to speak at different events. And I was going to say that being involved in an international organization where you can be active as a lawyer would be something that I would advise you to do. Join AIJA, especially for young lawyers. Join even if you don't intend to attend an event, because there's newsletters, you get to know lawyers in different jurisdictions. You'll get to see who's leading the arbitration commission, the tax commission, the human rights commission, et cetera. And those will give you contacts automatically, and you'll have an affinity through your membership in AIJA, because it's a good family that you develop. And I'd probably say that same thing, and that was the sharp left turn in the question, was when they said non-lawyer. So I would probably say the same thing. I would seek out an internationally minded and internationally focused student group, or let's say business group or whatever. There's plenty of trade associations out there if you've given an idea as to a specific sector, such as industry or manufacturing or whatever. But I would say join those associations where they're internationally focused, because those will give you contacts. That'll be your stepping stone to getting local contacts overseas where your focus is.
Great. No, thank you. Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, the student, I think, is a law student, but the study abroad experience was from undergraduate, not during law school. So
Okay.
is there a significant difference if the student said, well, I didn't study abroad at law school, but I did study abroad undergraduate, or is there additional value to studying abroad during law school? Or would a law firm view that as being, say, a party semester abroad and not one that was valuable? Yeah.
Okay. I'll make it short. The latter. Okay. That the answer is yes. I think that there is much more value when you're a little bit more mature as a student, meaning you're no longer going through your undergraduate, where they think you're backpacking through Spain or Nepal as part of your undergraduate experience. But that's not meant to diminish those experiences. Those experiences are very important because they help you expand. And if you can turn those into a relevant factor in your interview process or on your resume to say that I went to X, and as part of that undergraduate program I was studying social mores in a given country, or I was studying con law or human rights or something in the context of the EU or whatever. In other words, if you're able to tie it to something that's relevant in the practice of law, it would have relevance. But again, a big but is that I think that the LLM program demonstrates that you're focused at a different point in your educational career. So I think the LLM has at that point, you should even be more laser focused on what you want to do, and it probably has more value.
Great. The next question comes, certainly Morgan, I hope that was a good answer for you. The next question comes from our friend Carly Topke at the University of Texas. And she's asking, I think this is a question that goes to Carol, which is, what are some good ideas for LLM JD integration that are sustainable and have gained traction? Have you seen that in your research? But Malcolm, I'd ask that question to you as well, not within the law school environment, but in the law firm environment. Are there things that you've done that have integrated and brought together lawyers of different backgrounds and nationalities that have been successful? But Carol, I'll go to you first.
So it's a great question for both of us. I'm married to somebody who's a longtime and former Sidley lawyer. And so I got to go to all their, events and parties when people were still getting together in the world. And it did sometimes look like a middle school lunchroom when, people from a particular place would sit together with their friends, and just across the way were people who they really should be meeting, but they were a little hesitant for some reason. And I know that happens. It's not just, I'm not calling out Sidley alone, that happens generally in life. So the research says, and actually my own experience also confirms this, is that people get to know each other by working together. So that could be a class, it could be a club, if they actually have a role in a club. It could be a sports team, could be all kinds of things, but they need a role. So just to say, here's $50, go out for dinner, probably doesn't do it. There has to be some kind of purpose to their interaction in order for it to get sticky enough to last. So that means that you do have to involve faculty, as well as other parts of a law school. And I always think of this in terms of choreography, that the law school as a whole has to design this kind of interaction. It can't just throw people together and say, okay, you're in the room, talk to each other, because that tends not to work. What does work is giving them a role, giving them a job, giving them a project that they have to do together. And the most wonderful project from my perspective is one that shifts the power dynamics of the students, so that the students who are at the law school for just 1 year and may not be as fluent in English as others actually have the information that the others need. So that is my ideal project, but almost any working relationship will do if they really have to interact.
Thank you. Thanks. And Malcolm, what would you add? What can we learn in law schools from your law firm practice?
I probably echo what Carol says in the transference of that to a law firm, because I fully agree with the experience that just throwing some money at a new lawyer in the firm and giving them an allowance to do something doesn't teach them skills. Some of the basics that we do. I tomorrow is my rotational turn for our international practice group, and every month we have a meeting. And it is true that being part of a group, that's sort of what I was saying earlier about Aisha and joining the association. Those kinds of affinity groups are very, very important for developing skills, developing, the one of the reasons why I tell people to join the bar associations is join when you have the ability to speak, write a paper, continue your legal education in the context of polishing the human skills that you need to be an effective lawyer. In the law firm environment, we do the same thing. I've invited all of our associates to attend our consul. We have consul general lunches. We have lots of consul generals, I think over 100 now in the LA metropolitan area, or at least in California. You invite them for these events, you bring them in, you introduce them, give them a role. Carol, I cannot agree with you more on that point. Being a member of something is not really participating. I've told people that repeatedly. Anybody can be a member, but not everybody can be a participant and actually actively organize a course or organize remarks or actually get into the, do the organization part of it. And so I tell people be active in those affinity groups. And from our perspective, we encourage the lawyers to in fact do that, to participate, and we try and get them together as often as possible, which by the way is why I think when I hear some apocalyptic people say that there's the death of the office environment, I don't agree. I mean, we're going to use it more efficiently in our firm too. We're going to use it. We may go to hoteling and having sharing office, but it'll never go away, because we need that kind of interaction within the firm in order to develop effective lawyers.
Great. Thank you, Malcolm. Carly, I hope that was a good answer for you. The next question goes to Malcolm, and then the following will go to both of you. Malcolm, one of the attendees is asking on your point regarding the focus of the firm. They're asking, how can you understand a firm's focus on the market through their website, especially since a lot of firms have a wide variety of practices on their website?
That's an excellent question, because I actually, when I do my homework on opposing counsel, I'm doing that exact same thing. I'm going to the website to see what the resources are of the firm. And, we have a lot of firms that have good names, but they might not have necessarily the depth in a given area. So you can typically tell by, for example, visit our firm, and you can look up my name and go down and see what the skills are and see if those skills are things that match your interests. And that works with each. And then you can look at who the rest of the support staff is. If it's merely, let's say, a figurehead in that area, you're going to be able to tell if you're focused on it. You can tell who's writing litigation articles, and you can also cross-check that if you wish against LinkedIn. I do that too. Take a look at a firm that I'm not familiar with, and I'll look at the opposing number and their LinkedIn qualifications to see, do they really have a depth of experience in this area or not? And that's what I mean by drilling down and getting a little bit of information on the firm you're interested in.
Thank you. The next question is for both of you. And it's a question about, what do you think about the intellectual property area for an international JD student? And I would expand that to Carol, based on your research doing LLM employment outcome research as well. This inquirer has an engineering degree and relevant work experience, and is wondering if this career path is an advantage for international students right now. And I would expand that to say for JD or LLM.
Carol, do you want to take the ladies?
I'm curious about what you're going to say.
Oh, okay.
I was being diplomatic and not opposed to it.
Okay, I'll jump in. The last thing I ever want to do is to interrupt a judge or a professor. Okay. Well, first of all, I think that intellectual property is it's going to be with us for a very long time, and it is universally recognized. I was telling the story a while ago about when I was in China in the mid '90s, and I met some government types, and during that discussion, the conversation turned to, "Why are you in America so concerned about intellectual property? It's not real property. It's just an idea." And I watched that from the mid '90s to today, where intellectual property is a very, very strong component of most Chinese practices and successful practices, because they've developed their own brands, their own processes, their own patents, and the ABA has helped, and different committees have helped to expand. So I think intellectual property there's a universal component to it. So I think an engineering degree is specifically helped. We have 3 patent lawyers in the LA office who have engineering degrees, and where they're kept busy. I mean, keep in mind in this day and age with all of the let's say high tech work that we're doing, it becomes a very, very competitive area, and I think it creates a lot of job opportunities. But again, beyond the skills that you have as an engineer or as with that engineering background, et cetera, do keep in mind that people skills are part of the program, because more and more the firms want lawyers who are not only going to be able to do the work, but are going to be able to help solicit and bring in clients and make pitches and bring in the good clients for that work. So you need to have both sets of skills.
Thank you for going first. Okay. So here's what I was thinking, Malcolm, and I wasn't sure about this. I don't know how, I wasn't sure whether the question was about the importance of US IP law or deals versus litigation. I wasn't sure about that. And so I love the way you answered that. So I can sort of add a little gloss to what you're saying, but not a lot. So one thing, when I was going through these 7 firms on the LCA data, they list the title of the individual. They also list their salary. And there were a lot of patent-related people. Some were identified as lawyers and some were not. And the other thing I was going to say is that in earlier work, I looked at US-based law firms with international offices. And I went through and coded the lawyer biographies for all the lawyers in the overseas offices of these firms. And then looked at kind of the offices generally too. And what I found, and this is not rocket science to you, Malcolm, but it was a little bit more rocket sciencey to me at the time. What I found was that the firms really specialized their overseas offices more than I had anticipated. So London offices are big and they might do all kinds of work, but an office in Frankfurt versus an office in Shanghai wouldn't necessarily do everything. And so the answer that I would also give to the person who's asking this question is, think about where you want to work and who would employ you. And is this a center for the IP kind of work that is found in some jurisdictions in the United States? Or is it, and what kind of IP work? Is it more litigation work? Is it more deal work? I know lots of international students shy away from anything litigation because they feel it's not transferable. But actually in that work that looked at what lawyers in overseas offices of US firms are doing, there were litigation examples. I was really surprised at how much litigation is being done overseas. Not necessarily by US licensed lawyers, but by the office. So that's what I have to add, not a lot.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. This brings us to our next question from, well, Carly, I see your second question about the value of JD study abroad, which I think Malcolm addressed. And so this brings us to a question from our friend Clayton Steele at Brooklyn Law School. She's listed 3 and asked us to choose one. So I'm just going to choose the first one for Malcolm and for Carol. Have you observed trends in LLM hiring at the large international firms to opening up spots to the open hiring market and moving away from the pre-selection practice of home country partners placing their STAR associates with an international firm partner as a professional courtesy?
I haven't, this is not something I know enough about to say much. I know it happens, but I also know the opposite happens, that it is, more happenstance, more, more along the lines that you might characterize a JD hiring. And I don't have a sense of change over time. I wish I did. It's a great question.
Well, I'm glad you lobbed that one out first, Carol, because I was going to say my experience, because the question talked about trends, and I was going to say exactly that. I don't see any trend. I think it's, I don't want to say catch as catch can, but I think it's just, it depends on a lot of other factors other than a trend. It's not something that firms are, let's say, installing a protocol of that type. Not that I've seen.
Yeah, it's a great question for research, actually. So Clayton, if you're interested, let me know.
Great, well, thank you. And so we have a few other questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I see Youngmin, you have had your hand up, and Simon, I see your question about SJDs, and Clara, is yours as well. However, we are going to transition to our section social right now, where we're just going to open this up to an informal conversation. And we would look forward to, it's intended to be informal, so we can continue this conversation or talk about other topics that would be interesting to those who are here. And so finally, I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you so much to everyone who participated today, taking the time to prepare your remarks and answer the questions, and be a part of this first webinar for the section